I am going to go over just a number of events that are from today. If you don't know me, my name is Darren Gertis. I do these daily, and if you spend 10 minutes with me, you'll know everything that you need to know about what happened today in Ukraine. Okay, so here we go. First article, Russia pounds Kharkiv region with fresh air and artillery strikes. It's ongoing. Donbass, they're still fighting. Nothing really has changed there. There are some interesting things like fit for fighting, a combat training for civilians is now part of Ukraine's wartime lifestyle. Like this is like the new CrossFit kind of thing in the gym because they're actually learning these kinds of things so that they can protect themselves when it comes to potentially having to protect themselves in a life or death situation. The British intelligence update talked about what happened in Crimea on August 16th. Both Russians and Ukrainian officials acknowledged that something blew up. Now, the Russians acknowledged it differently. They just said something blew up and all this civilian infrastructure was hurt. Go back and watch this yesterday. It's amazing. The Western press explained, oh, it was an ammo dump. It looks like Ukraine did it, and it wasn't just civilian infrastructure. It was actually planes last week and an ammo dump today and an airfield today as well, or yesterday as well. Dakhanskoye and Gardzenskoye, please forgive me, I'm not Ukrainian, are home to two of the most important Russian military air bases in Crimea. The Russian commanders will highly likely be increasingly concerned with the apparent deterioration in the security across Crimea. That's obvious because there are replacements now. Russia replaces the Black Sea Fleet chief after the Crimea setbacks. So there's a new commander. Russia has replaced the commander of its Crimean-based Black Sea Fleet, state news agency reported on Wednesday. Moscow blames saboteurs. Plumes of smoke were seen rising, and it goes on. Now, how did it carry in Pravda? Putin appoints a new commander. Vice Admiral Viktor Sloklov has been appointed new commander of the Black Sea Fleet. This is the name of the previous commander, and he was appointed in 2019. But nothing about like, he's got to be replaced because he allowed 3 explosions over the last week. Okay, in other news, here we have CNN article. And by the way, I tried to triangulate. This is CNN. I just talked about Reuters and Pravda. I'm going to talk about Al Jazeera, The Guardian, Interfax, Ukraine, and RT before we're done. Ukraine admits that it was behind 3 explosions in Crimea, and here's what we know. And yeah, these 3 explosions, President Zelensky said the war began with Crimea. It must end with the liberation of Crimea. And so again, it's a big thing, but here I want to get to the end where it said the Kavul group said the Saki attack was audacious and highly effective in both damaging Russian reinforcements and striking a significant psychological blow to the morale amongst the Russian military and civilians. That's right. Russia has taken it kind of for granted that Crimea was pretty safe, and now they're having to rethink that with the drone attack a couple weeks ago, and then the air base, and now the ammo dump, and now the replacement of the general. It's not looking really good for the Russians. Okay, so the admiral is replaced, and we just talked about that. Let's look at this. The enemy launches about now. Pravda also talks about things sometimes where you're like, really, is that right? Sometimes they get it right. Ukraine's commander-in-chief speaks about the difficult situation in the Ukrainian army. And so they're quoting Valery Zaluzhny, commander-in-chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, who said Russian forces strike the positions of the Ukrainian military 700 to 800 times a day. Imagine that, 700 to 800 times a day. The Russian armed forces use from 40 to 60,000 shells daily, he also wrote. And you would think that's exaggeration if you didn't know better, but you can see this on Ukraine Inform. This is like estimates of what's happening every day, and I would highly recommend that you triangulate, that you read this, that you read Reuters, that you read things like CNN or Al Jazeera or The Guardian or whatever so that you can get a sense. But here's the exact quote from there. I trust things when I can triangulate, and I would urge you to do the same. Okay, Zelensky's office threatens to destroy the Crimean Bridge. Kyiv plans to destroy the Crimean Bridge. Mikhail Polodak, an advisor to the head of the office of the President Zelensky, said such objects must be destroyed, he said. Now, if I were him, and this is in Pravda, and Pravda I don't really trust, but I think nobody's doubting that Zelensky wants to do that. What is the bridge that we're talking about? Here is Crimea. Above this is the rest of Ukraine. This is also Ukraine, now annexed by Russia, but illegally in 2014. Here's the Kerch Bridge that is what connects Russia with the rest of Ukraine. Now, this supply line was used all the way up here because that ammo dump being destroyed was somewhere up around here on this crossroads. So if you can cut this supplier line, you really put the Russians in kind of a pickle. Now they have to supply either from up here along the border and get things down, or they have to do it by sea. So I would want to blow up that bridge too if I was Zelensky. Okay, 19 U.S. generals, retired generals and ex-officials urged the U.S. to increase arms supplies to Ukraine. They're saying, look, you got to do this, otherwise you might be unintentionally seizing defeat from the jaws of victory. That's what these generals think about the situation in Ukraine. You can win. You just have to make sure that they have the tools. The Biden administration has been a little bit cautious about giving them missiles that can go 100, 150 miles. Now, with those missiles, they will definitely, if they get these missiles, not the HIMARS, but the HIMARS big brother, it's like ATAMs or something like that. If they get those missiles, this bridge is gone in no time flat. You just mark my words. But out of an overabundance of caution about provoking the Russian escalation, conventional as well as nuclear, we're in effect ceding the initiative to Russian President Vladimir Putin. And this was one of the generals talking about the army. This is what I was talking about, ATACMS. Talking about the Army Tactical Missile System, which have a range of 300 kilometers or 186 miles, which Kyiv was repeatedly requesting. Sullivan said that a fear of escalation played a role in withholding them. A key goal is to ensure that we do not end up in a circumstance where we're heading down the road toward a third world war. So, you know, deterrence is working, but it's actually Putin deterring the United States, which is a terrible place for this to be. But these generals recognize, look, if you press the thing, it's going to work. And so I think that's really good news that they're saying this. Okay, here's another thing. Now, there's a political front as well. There's a military war, there's an economic war with sanctions, there's a political war with the way that the West has kind of lined up, and there's a information war. So Russia and the West vie for influence amid African caution on Ukraine war. About 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, was in Africa on this tour of 4 or 5 countries, Egypt and Algeria and Ethiopia, I think, and Uganda, if I remember correctly, where he was essentially saying, hey, look, we Russia, we've never colonized you. And they're true. They never have colonized Africans. Okay, so they can say that truly. Now, they've always decided that they were going to colonize like neighbors, like Ukraine and things. I mean, that's how they tried to colonize. So they just knock over neighbors. But they're trying to, and now many of these African nations, they want to stay kind of neutral. Europe and the West have characterized Russia's operation as a war. African leaders are far more cautious and they want to remain neutral. And so the leaders of the Verkhovna Rada, Verkhovna Rada is the Ukrainian parliament. That's the name of their parliament, like the Seimas in Lithuania is the same thing, or Congress in the United States. Before receiving the status of candidate status in the European Union, the leadership of the Verkhovna Rada had met with speakers from almost all EU countries. Now they're starting an African track and meeting with the parliaments and speakers of African countries in order to dispel the myth of the Russian Federation is spreading about Ukraine. And they need to do this because Lavrov went and just lied. Okay. U.S. is to buy $68 million worth of wheat from Ukraine through the World Food Program. Now, I generally don't like the U.S. spending money on stuff that they don't need to because we have problems at home. We have a $30 trillion deficit. The rest of the countries around the world have huge deficits post-COVID as well. But, you know, we ought to, I fundamentally feel like we ought to not do this. Now, I'm all for supplying weapons to Ukraine so they can defend themselves. But here they're getting a twofer. They're getting a twofer in this way because they're simultaneously feeding the world, the poorest of the poor that will need the food. We're doing a peaceful mission to help them, and simultaneously we're helping Ukraine by getting their food out. Last article, this is an RT. RT says some crazy stuff. And by the way, if you want to see all the lies and things that RT and others, the myths and propaganda. There's this great article in NewsGuard, Russian-Ukraine Disinformation Tracking Center, 252 websites spreading war disinformation. Look this up, and they myth after myth after myth about what's going on. Well, here's one that I haven't seen recently, but Germany wants to retake Polish soil, and they go on about how Berlin plans to subjugate Eastern Europe, and they're just making stuff up. Germany's vision for the future in Europe is cooperation of two empires, Russia and German, with this spheres of influence between both power. They're just making stuff up. They had one on here that was, now what they weren't making up was things like when they carried what Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, said, where he had this actual like map of pre 2014 map of Ukraine, and they said this is what Zelensky thinks that Ukraine will look like, and then an actual map of post invasion where Russia has half of Ukraine, Ukraine is limited to nothing but Kyiv, and then for some inexplicable reason, Poland has like 7 of the oblasts. That's the states or the provinces. And I think Romania had a couple of them. It was bizarre. Okay, that's all the news that's fit to print today. Thank you for your time. If you're with me so far, you've stayed this long, please subscribe and come back tomorrow. And thank you for caring about Ukraine.